Hey, what's up? It's me, Tim Keys. I'm back. And in this video, oh my word, I wanted to talk about Pro Tools. Shout out to Bolo and Barry Bonds, I think that's his name, because these guys have brought up some interesting points about Pro Tools. And I kind of wanted to chime in and give my very limited, but my perspective and experience using this DAW. So for me, I went back, starting back, like I was making music using MTV Music Generator. And at the time, having a PlayStation game that allowed you to kind of like make music compositions was pretty cool. And, know, for the time that I was making the music back then, like I was considered to be pretty good by some of my peers. And I even got some opportunities, as a result of that. On the other hand, like as I got older, right around like the end of like my high school career, going into like graduation and whatnot, I would hear people talk about Pro Tools, and specifically, I had a friend that was a couple years older than me, and he was already in college, and he was actually at the Art Institute of Atlanta, and he was telling me about this program called Pro Tools and how great it was, and at the time how you can do all of these wonderful things using this piece of software. And so you had to get it right. So I ended up picking up Pro Tools initially from him. He gave me a copy of his disc, and unfortunately it didn't work, so I never used it. Moved on to use another program, and then a few years later I ended up picking up Pro Tools LE version 6, and I had the Mbox 1, like the Focusrite Mbox 1. And at the time I thought it was pretty neat because I picked up Pro Tools 6 back in 2005, and so at the time there was nothing quite like it from my experience. Like, here it is, I had this interface and it allowed me to plug in like my keyboards and my guitars, and I could just run the cables in through the inbox and then record my audio that way into the DAW. It took a while to set up, but overall it was pretty neat to do, and it allowed me to jot down some ideas in a way that I couldn't have done so at the time. Also, I'll say that one of the other benefits for me getting the software was the other software that came along with Pro Tools, like getting the Korg M1 LE edition, Reason, I think it was Reason Adapted at the time, Amplitude, Ableton. You know, you would buy these pieces of hardware, and it would come bundled with these other pieces of software on disk, and you put the disk in, upload everything to your computer, and register it with the company. And lo and behold, you get all these additional pieces of software that, if you wanted to, you could upgrade those pieces of software for relatively inexpensive. So that was the benefit. Now, circling back to Pro Tools. Now, for me, I had Pro Tools, and I'll say that when I had Pro Tools and I would tell other people like I had Pro Tools at the time, this was back in like 2005 and 2006, when people found out that I had Pro Tools, the benefit was back then that people took me more serious as like a quote unquote musician slash beat maker slash producer. Like, if I was to say, well, I made all these other beats on MTV Music Generator on this video game, or the software, because they also had Music Generator on the computer, and you could get it and do pretty much the same thing on the computer as you could on the PlayStation, with more memory. But back to that at another time. So when I would tell people that versus when I said, oh, yeah, by the way, I got Pro Tools, I definitely got a different response, especially from people who are like, quote unquote, like the rock musician crowd. Mind you, I'm in New England at this point, so things were, different in terms of like what is or what was accepted as like validation in music. Being in Atlanta, you made beats and whatnot, and for the most part, my experiences, at least among like my peers and like locally, if I made a beat CD or something like that, and the music sounded good, people would want to buy the music, and they had no problems with it because it's Atlanta, and Atlanta had a significantly bigger hip hop scene, and I would even dare say just a bigger industry scene overall. However, in New England, especially in my current location, you really don't have a strong music industry presence, comparatively speaking, and definitely don't have a strong like rap, hip hop, R&B, urban music scene. It was mostly up here in New England, like the rock music scene, some folk music, the alternative stuff. So it was harder to find people that was into the urban music space, or they didn't consider rap music. That's a whole different topic. But my point is, once I told them, oh yeah, I have Pro Tools, it was like, oh man, well, you must be really a serious musician, producer, whatever you want to call it. And so now again, my experience with Pro Tools was, yes, I have the ability to record audio into the computer and jot down my ideas that I had, with my guitar, with my keyboard, in a way that, I couldn't do with any other product at the time. Mind you, back in 2005, Reason back then was not the Reason that it is today. Reason was more of a companion based software that you would use with something like Cubase or Pro Tools, or, any other DAW that could support audio, but you wouldn't run Reason in by itself because it just didn't have the capability at that time. I was not familiar with Cubase or Logic. I was primarily on PC, and to be frank, like we use Pro Tools because like that's what was recommended. Like I got on Pro Tools because a friend of mine who went to the Art Institute of Atlanta and was shooting videos and needed something to edit audio was like, this is what we're using in our studios and our classrooms, and this is what I have in my studio when I'm editing videos. We use Pro Tools. And so in my head, that was always like the best to get. However, I will say with using Pro Tools, especially at that time, as cool as it was for recording audio and putting it into your computer and working on music from that standpoint, live audio recording, that was great. However, the downside was in terms of like the compositional aspects of music compared to something like a FL Studio, even back then, or an Ableton, even back then, or even Reason for that matter. Like I could make a track, like a beat, if you will, in Reason with no problem. My drum sequencing, the the compositional piece with the music, all the virtual instruments and sounds in Reason were there. So it was easy for me to construct different ideas and have different song genres that I could run in Reason, even back in version 3. I couldn't do that in Pro Tools the same way. Everything was mainly used for audio, like direct audio recording. And so, as great as that was, over time, that became like less appealing, especially considering the fact, like even back then, like Ableton 5, if I'm not mistaken, whichever version I had bundled with the software, once I had the inbox plugged in, it could also handle audio and I could record my audio and I could sequence my MIDI in using Ableton. And so, like, over time, for me, my experience was like I found myself not really using Pro Tools as much because it was easier for me to get my ideas down in other DAWs. Now, in terms of like the industry standard, I mean, again, I would hear people say like, yeah, Pro Tools is the industry standard. However, I would also see a lot of people where I was at using Logic. And by the mid 2000s, 2008, 2009, and then like early 2010s, Logic was definitely more feature rich than a Pro Tools. And again, an Ableton was more feature rich than a Pro Tools. For granted, Ableton to get the full edition was $800, still is, but one could argue once you had a software program like Ableton and you understood how to use it, you could do a lot with it. Dare I say, a lot more with that than you could with something like Pro Tools, depending on what your needs are. However, when I would bump into other musicians, even around the late 2009 time frame, 2010, 2012, that timeline, the consensus was always, well, I'll make my track in FL Studio and then I'll mix and master it in Pro Tools. Or they'll say, I'll make my beats in Reason and then I'll do the mixing and mastering in Pro Tools. So for the longest, when it came to like mixing and mastering the final product, the consensus was getting it done in Pro Tools. However, like a lot of folks, I think when Pro Tools moved to like a subscription base and kind of got off the perpetual license, especially in the way that you don't really own, like you always have to like do the subscription, but you never have anything to show for it once you cancel the subscription. I think that really hurt Pro Tools. And then mind you, when the kids, like the younger generation, started picking up on programs like FL Studio, it was a wrap, because you would see those guys, they get FL Studio, especially once FL Studio had the ability to really handle audio recording, which, I mean, to be fair, that goes back to like 2006, because I got an early version of FL Studio that allowed you to handle, like, record audio in internally, and that feature was around back in 2006. And so once that began to improve, especially by the 2010s, and definitely like 2016, like that time frame with trap music, it was like, yep, you would hear about Pro Tools being in studios, but in terms of what people were using, it was more like I would hear people saying I'm using Ableton, or I'm using Logic, or I'm using FL, or I'm using Reason, or Cubase, or even Cakewalk before they went out. And so at this point in time, would I look at something like Pro Tools as an industry standard? I mean, no. Now, for granted, one of the things that made Pro Tools kind of like, appealing and kind of a pain at the same time was the hardware software issue. And what I mean by that is like, you had to, like, for the longest, you had to have Pro Tools and like the Pro Tools Inbox 1 or Inbox 2, maybe. I think Inbox 3, by the time they got to Inbox 3, they kind of moved away from like, you didn't have to have the Inbox 3 exclusively to use Pro Tools. But in that Inbox 1, Inbox 2 era, like, you could have an Inbox and use a different software with the Inbox 1, but you couldn't use Pro Tools without the Inbox. And so that was kind of like, that was a draw for some people, because everything was supposed to be calibrated or worked out in a way where everything was just kind of like in sync, like it worked well together. And of course, like, even by the time they got to like, I think it was Pro Tools 8, Pro Tools 9, by the time Inbox 3 came out, where it was like you didn't necessarily need an Inbox 3 in order to use Pro Tools, the consensus still was like, it's best if you have the Inbox with Pro Tools, or whatever Pro Tools hardware stuff was, you wanted to have that in line with Pro Tools when you used it. when you're doing your audio recording, or it wouldn't work as good. But like, I just think after a while, like the other companies with their hardware, like Focusrite, after Inbox One, Focusrite was also, just doing their own thing. Like the Inbox Two wasn't made by Focusrite. Focusrite was making their own, pieces of hardware, their own interfaces, and now a lot of times in home recording studios, you'll see like the Scarlett 2s or the Scarlett 3s in most people's home studios because they're a good quality product. Their cost of entry is relatively cheap to get your hands on, and you can get a good product and a good sound even out of that. And there's so many other interfaces that you can choose from that sound just as good. And when you buy the stuff, pardon me, you have when you buy it, it's yours. It's not, you spend $200 for the year or however much it costs for the subscription, and then you don't really keep anything. And so that's kind of important to think about in terms of like the standing of where Pro Tools is now compared to where it used to be, as things have kind of changed in the technology realm, and you know as we've kind of moved on with hardware and the software we use, as Pro Tools has kind of gotten comfortable in a lot of areas, and the company that runs it, you know, people have kind of moved on. Now, I will say I do know a lot of people, or a few people who do video that swear by Pro Tools. I got some friends who make videos and whatnot for like they're working for their jobs, and they're more like they swear by, hey, we got to use Pro Tools in order to like record the audio. And I tell them, in my opinion, I don't think it's necessary. There are other pieces of software that can do the job. But for them, like they still have that perception and that mindset that's like, hey, I need to use Pro Tools. Whatever it is about Pro Tools that, however it handles audio, I will say Pro Tools does a great job with the handling of audio for certain mixes and whatnot. But then again, in this day and age, you have the studio ones, you have the Reapers, you have the Mix Bus Harrison if you're into that, you have the Cubase, you have BandLab, Sonar. I don't know if that's still free or not, but like those tools are available, and they also do a really good job with just straight audio recording. And so there are alternatives out there that people can use, and for whatever reason, again, like people don't like subscriptions. And when Pro Tools went from a a perpetual license to a subscription based program exclusively, I think that really hurt them. And they're kind of still like, I know at one point they went back and started doing perpetual licenses, and then like they're back on the subscription thing. And so when you have that sort of dynamic, pardon me, I apologize. When you have that sort of dynamic, and yet you have all of these other companies out here that are creating various products that have, different features and more features, and the price point is less expensive, and, the quality varies depending on what you're buying when it comes to hardware, but it's for a cheaper price. It's harder to justify. But it's interesting to like go back as I'm looking right now. Like this was a version of Pro Tools. Matter of fact, I think I still have this disc in one of my office desks somewhere in my house. And so I can remember buying the inbox and opening it up, and I had this disc along with a bunch of others, like all the software that came with it, which that was cool because you buy your software, even when you get the LE version back then at the time, you could register that stuff, and then like when it was time to do a sale, you might get like a bundle for cheap, And so instead of paying $500 or $200 to get a bundle of software, you only pay 50 because you already had one of the license that would have got you that. Let's see real quick. Box one. Let's see what we got. Yep. So yeah, I had this is the OG inbox. So this was like it back in the day. Like for me at least, like having this, you know, having this in my little home studio setup when I wanted to have people come over and we talk about music, like you want to record. That was like, oh man, he's serious. This little thing right here, for whatever reason, made me legitimate as an aspiring, now failed, so to speak, producer. Having that little box, and yeah, now it's like when you go into a studio, or even when you look at other people's like home studios for that matter, you don't even see these pieces of equipment there. And that's no disrespect to Avid or Pro Tools or any of that. It's just a nod to how things have changed over time. So, let me know your thoughts. Are you someone that still uses Pro Tools? Do you think it's still the industry standard? Have you ever used Pro Tools? Have you moved on to other stuff? Let me know in the comments section. I'm Tim Keys. I'm out. Peace.